So with that, Ian, the chair all yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of the Special Access Program. My slides are not available as handouts, but my email will be available at the end of the presentation. If anyone would like a copy, or if anyone has further questions, I'm happy to take them through that venue. So just an overview of a number of things I want to cover, just a bit about the history of the program, the mandate and scope, roles and responsibilities of the various players in the system, how we make decisions, a bit about risk management, the things we take into account with respect to risk management, and specifically why we're all gathered here today, of course, how we handle applications for radiopharmaceuticals, some of the challenges we have with those and other applications, and some advice to physicians who use the program. So in Canada, most of you are familiar that there are three ways in which drugs can be accessed. One is market authorization. That's the sort of what I call the good housekeeping stamp of approval, Health Canada's approval for a drug and it being available through normal means, pharmacies, etc. The second, of course, is experimental therapies through approved clinical trials, and these, of course, are narrow applications and narrow approvals in the sense that they are only for a specific period of time and for a particular protocol. And the third, which is an exception to everything else, is the Special Access Program. We provide compassionate access to drugs before they're approved, when other things have failed, when clinical trials are not available, and when nothing else works. A bit about the history of the program. The program grew out of the thalidomide tragedy in the 1960s, and after the tragedy, the acts and regulations were amended significantly, and at that time there were high standards of safety and efficacy and quality that became implicit in the regulations. However, the drafters didn't want to sort of close off the tap totally, so they left a small relief valve in a similar way that Bob was speaking about his program. Our program is a relief valve to the high standards which are normally expected to be met with respect to the availability of drugs. So the mandate then that flowed from that and since is we have a mandate to provide access to non-marketed drugs for practitioners who are treating patients with emergency or serious and life-threatening conditions when other therapies have failed and or unsuitable for particular clinical reasons or for whatever reason unavailable, and when clinical trials are not an option. Our authority is derived from the Food and Drugs Act and regulation, and without going into the particulars, there's a couple of facts. One, the authority is discretionary, meaning we have the authority to approve or not. The sale, that particular sale, is exempt from all provisions of the Food and Drugs Act and regulation. So that which is normally expected to be in place, patients and physicians, of course, rely on high standards being in place. Those things evaporate with a special access authorization and really leaving the physician on the hook. That's not to say they're totally on the hook, because we bear significant responsibility too, but with respect to liability, it is significantly increased in our setting. And the practitioner has to agree to report on the use of drugs as well. The scope, we have a broad scope of products on the program, generally defined as new drugs, but we deal with pharmaceuticals, radiopharmaceutical, biologics, blood products, vaccines. Some of the drugs we deal with are in the Canadian review process. They're being reviewed. Others have been removed from the Canadian market for safety reasons or because of low commercial value. Drugs that companies are just not interested in coming to Canada with, which is a big problem from time to time. Orphan drugs for rare diseases, a big specialty of ours. And from time to time, there are drugs that lack intellectual property protection, and a company will not want to come to Canada, and instead these things are available through the program. We deal on rare occasions with natural health products only when those natural health products happen to fall within the definition but are still used to treat a serious and life-threatening condition. And as I said, emergency in our circumstances is defined as serious and life-threatening, and we cover drugs for treatment, diagnosis, and prevention. The theory of how our application and our processes work is really quite straightforward. We have a physician who files an application with us. We consider that application quite rapidly, actually, usually within 24 hours. And if we approve, then we send an authorization to a manufacturer, and the manufacturer then in turn sells the product to the physician. Our day, however, is anything but. We have any amount of influences that come to bear on these things. And you see one, I added a thing in there last night with Dr. Reed. For instance, a physician who would contact us regularly, more than other folks, and so there are certain relationships that get developed within that. But we have influences, and some good and some bad on a daily basis, sometimes on an application basis. And so our day is anything but planned. You see some things here. Our senior management, members of Parliament become involved. Manufacturers impose certain restrictions. Marketing departments of pharmaceutical companies get involved, which we are not big on. Customs has to be involved if it's coming from overseas. Distributors, blood banks, you name it. Most of the physicians we deal with are specialists, so therefore we have very good relationships with these folks. The quack in the corner is for, to be very crass, we deal on occasion with folks, and I know there's none in the room, who practice very, very questionable medicine, and we're in a position to adjudicate that. We like to say if it walks like a duck and sounds like a duck, well, they're a quack. With respect to roles and responsibilities, particularly the practitioner has a key responsibility to initiate the request. They have to be convinced that there's a data to support it. It has to be an evidence-based decision. They have to provide patients, of course, with that information if that's not already known to the patient. They have to report on the use of the drugs, and if we ask, they have to provide an accounting for all supplies received. Our responsibilities are quite broad, and I won't go into each one of them, but of course we receive and process these applications. We bring our minds to each individual application within a very rapid time frame, as I said. We deal with follow-up reports, adverse drug reactions, and we'll often have to go back to either the manufacturer and or the physician with respect to trying to smoke out more information about adverse drug reactions, because we want to know if something is really going wrong or if it's something related to the disease. We also have a huge risk management component to our work. We always emphasize first-line therapies or other therapies that are available. And sometimes that's not always, physicians will come to us and it's surprising the number of times that we have to go back and ask, well, why would you not have used X, Y, and Z? And sometimes there's good answers and sometimes there's not. We always are encouraging exchange of drug information between key stakeholders, for instance, between manufacturers and physicians and between physicians and patients. And we do a lot behind the scenes to make sure physicians have access to the most accurate information, the most up-to-date and accurate information about the drugs that they're choosing. We sometimes have information that we're privy to that physicians would not. It may not be in the literature. It may be privy to us by virtue of us looking at an application. So we have to make sure what we know is conveyed to the physician. And the manufacturer, of course, plays a key role. They have to decide whether or not they're going to respond to an application. Our authorizations do not compel the manufacturer to provide, so they have to make their own decision as to whether or not they're comfortable. They can impose conditions on the sale if they choose. They're responsible, again, for providing drug information. And particularly when there's significant new information, particularly from other jurisdictions, we demand that we know so that physicians will know. Just a bit about organization, the sort of onion chart. The call center where Dr. Reed calls frequently is basically a call center that receives about 100 to 150 calls a day. Around that are a number of regulatory staff, myself and other managers. And then we have at our fingertips and at the other end of the phone any number, probably about 200, 250 experts within Health Canada who are experts in oncology drugs and AIDS drugs, et cetera, et cetera. So we can pick up the phone and call them and seek to clarify something if we need. It's quite a rewarding experience to be able to do that. We couldn't possibly have the capacity within the program to know everything there is about every new experimental drug, and so we're very grateful to have this really so close. Are we busy? Yes, indeed, we are busy. We actually operate 24 hours a day. I don't want Dr. Reed to know that, but we do operate 24 hours.
The last time I had to get somebody in the middle of the night who didn't answer for 8 hours.
You can deal with that. But we do operate around the clock, primarily for blood products around the clock, things that are required for very urgent treatment. We have about 35,000 requests a year. There's about 2,700 drugs in the database historically, about 500 of which are active at any one time. We have new applications for new drugs, things we've never seen before on a regular basis, and we receive a lot of calls. In terms of outcomes, we receive and process, as I said, a lot in any given day. There's 3 drugs that are responsible for about 50% of our authorizations over the last year or so. And we send back, we call it a soft denial, but we send back about 20 to 25% of requests, so that sometimes it's as simple as a date of birth missing. Other times it's crucial information that's required to make the decision that's missing. But in the final analysis, very few are denied, probably in the order of Bob's statistics as well, probably in the order of about 5%. Authorization numbers go up and down through the years. We had a peak in 2002, 2003, and it's went down. There were a number of events which caused that, and now they're on the way back up again. So those are management challenges behind the scenes. Requests are initiated, as I said, by practitioners. There's a 2-page form that's available on our website that can be used. We receive most by fax, some by mail, believe it or not, and most are processed within 24 hours, and I've covered those things already. So, consideration matrix. These are the things that we consider when we receive a request. So quickly going through them, there's data available to us, so information that we might have in the course of our work as regulators. The clinical status of the patient. Is the prognosis bad? Are they in a particularly bad spot now? Can something wait, etc.? Other data that we might require. So in other words, we can go out and ask the physician for more data if we need. The seriousness of the disease, and this, of course, is the thing that expands and contracts on any given day. What is serious and what is not is a big challenge. Other therapies that have been tried and failed. The availability of clinical trials. Open-label clinical trials are common these days, and so that's an option which we consider. Prior patient experience with the drug. Is this a repeat situation? Market availability in other jurisdictions, so we want to know where it's available and in what jurisdictions and what kind of approvals are in place. And what, in the final analysis, are the risks without treatment. So these are the things we take into consideration with each request. I think these, that's right, I had animated that. So I won't go into all of these, but there's a number of things that we keep sort of at our desk side at all times, the kinds of things that we keep in mind. These are sometimes the things we have to refer to when things get tough. In other words, when physicians will be tough on us, and when patients are tough on us. So these are things we have to keep in mind that as I said, this is discretionary. So we do have the authority to say yes, and we have the authority to say no. But we do that as carefully and as compassionately as we can. The credibility of data is a big thing for us. Of course, you know, as clinicians, there are various levels and tiers of credibility with respect to data and publications, and this is a big thing for us. So we like published data, we like randomized controlled trials, but we don't often get them. We'll often get a request for something that there's a single case report for one patient from a part of the world that we wouldn't normally recognize as having good medicine. So these are the things that we are challenged with and things we have to keep in mind. The professional judgment of the physician clearly is crucial in all of this, but not the only factor. So that seems obvious. Just a bit about new drugs, things that are new to us, things we've never seen before. We have a particular process that we use, sort of a mini review. Still can be done quite quickly, but nevertheless is, and it's not to be compared with full market authorization, the kind of review we undertake in that context, but nevertheless it is a review. Just in the interest of time, I'll flip through to radiopharmaceuticals. So our access to radiopharmaceuticals really began through us in 1996 with the amalgamation of some functions within the unit. At that time, there were, quite frankly, only a handful, and there were decisions subsequent by the Biologics and Genetic Therapies Directorate to clarify the regulatory status of these compounds and at imaging centers across the country. And many of you will know and perhaps remember this. The reaction, of course, was mixed, shall I say, across the country. And however, there were deadlines, drop-dead deadlines put in place for centers to sort of come into line and to sort of agree that what was happening was compounding, but it was compounding with other purposes. And that led to negotiations between BGD and centers. As I said, there were deadlines imposed, and some products were ultimately marketed, which was good. Others were rolled into clinical trials at individual institutions, and the rest were subsequently available through the Special Access Program, primarily because of low demand. These are, the 10 patients a year kind of products. There was consolidation and then in the industry and challenges in manufacturing standards, which we continue to see today, which meant that some of these products have been discontinued from the market. It's a big problem for us. I think in the last 2 weeks we've dealt with 3 or 4 products that have been discontinued from the market, then now available through SAP. Some of these things are very important. There's no alternatives available, so there's just no choice. They need to be available. So we've stepped in to play a role. I have an endless list. These are just a couple of them. Some of them are familiar to you, no doubt. And this is just a small fragment of the things that we deal with and have dealt with. So what have we learned in all of this with respect to a relief valve? We know that, first and foremost, SAP works really well, but it is vulnerable to poor practices. If the physician is practicing less than good medicine, then that impacts on us, and it means that we then have to adjudicate on that, which puts us in a tough position because we don't regulate the practice of medicine, but we do regulate access to drugs. We feel that some level of risk management is really essential in all of this because of our position as regulators. We know stuff that you might not know. Disclosure is really important, particularly when we don't know a lot about something. Communication, where possible, should be proactive on the part of all stakeholders, and all experience is valuable. It may not be of the quality of randomized clinical trials, but nevertheless, it is very important. Some of the things we worry about, for instance, just a very simple graph, when the total experience on a drug, the Canadian experience, exceeds that which may have been obvious through clinical trials, we have a problem with that. We have a couple of examples of this where we've had the number of patients in Canada who have been exposed to a particular compound, say 400 or 500, which is pretty good for maybe that's a trial or a couple of trials. But the experience through SAP is almost an order of magnitude different. Yet we're not in a position to be able to go through medical records of after a product has been used. In other words, we have experienced those rare adverse events are probably showed up in SAP experience, but were not reported. So we worry when that's out of balance, and that's when we swoop in to try to say to manufacturers or others, we really think you need to either put this in a clinical trial where there's closer scrutiny or seek market authorization. One of my favorite slides, we're always worried. We're always worried about what might be obvious, what might be coming at us, and we're not prepared for it with respect to these unapproved drugs. These are new compounds, and we never really know what we might be confronted with. SAP Access draws attention to several boundaries. These are the gray areas that you're very familiar with. Research versus treatment versus medical practice. So what's research and what's treatment? This is a gray area, and we are left to adjudicate this on a regular basis. Clinical practice versus drug regulation. We deal with physicians who say, get out of my way. We have other physicians who will say that they will value the input that Health Canada will put into a given situation. Early access versus emergency access. Is it just because someone wants it, or is it because it's an emergency? The patient's right to choose, so autonomy issues versus the role of the government in protecting public health. And the classic thing we deal with is individual risk management, a physician and patient deciding what's best versus a population risk management paradigm. Advice for physicians who use our program very quickly. The form really should take less than 5 minutes to fill out, because I know you know all the facts about that individual patient when you would sit down. So it's really quite straightforward, but you have to be very particular. In the same way Bob mentioned, there has to be a clinical rationale, and it has to be clear. It doesn't have to be many words, it just has to be clear. Be sure to append citations that back up your claim that it's the best choice in a given circumstance. And think about a consent process that can manage the unknowns. With unapproved drugs, there are unknowns, and those need to be managed at the patient level. So a robust consent process is necessary. Where possible, consider a clinical trial. If you have more than a handful of patients, if this is part of your practice, then a clinical trial is a good thing to think about. You might want to lobby manufacturers who for whatever reason, are not coming to Canada. Prompting from physicians is much more effective than prompting from the regulator. And don't worry, while we sometimes sound tough, we do know that SAP is one of the only ways you're going to be able to get a hold of these things, so that's not going to end soon. But that's not to say that we might not ask questions about and plumb what the clinical reasons for choosing a particular thing, one thing over another. So that's the Whirlwind Tour. I know there's not a whole lot of time for questions, and my email is there, my phone is there, so please feel free to use it.